So recently, Andywarski held a debate on his channel between Richard Spencer, Styx, Sargon of Akkad, and his, co-host John Frank. And a lot of people have had mixed reactions to this. So I just wanted to dive into it and share my thoughts. I widely thought that Richard Spencer's arguments were just full of holes and didn't really make much sense. And I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me, so I'm going to be very precise in my description of what I thought. So first off, there's four major points from this debate that I want to talk about. The idea of the rights of the individual versus the rights of the collective, the relevance of ideals in the conversation, the question of what constitutes race, or more specifically, what is white, and then the implications of that on purity, cleansing, and purity spirals. There were definitely more things talked about in the debate. For example, I thought it just kind of turned into like a shit show with the whole aristocracy, monarchy, and whatnot. So I just want to deal with like the first hour and a half to 2 hours before things really, really fell apart. So the idea of the rights of the individual versus the rights of the collective. I'm going to agree with Sargon that the only rights that exist are the rights of the individual, and the role of the government is to protect those rights and to protect private property. Now, I'm going to try to engage with this a little bit more than Sargon did, though. So Richard Spencer says that, okay, so riddle me this. The nation state, is that a group or not? Because you obviously pay your taxes and you believe in the nation state, and so you do believe in this collective nation state. To which Sargon replies, well, is racial identitarianism something I have no choice over? And I think a lot of people, that question isn't going to make a lot of sense. Why did he answer a question with a question? It kind of seems like he's trying to dodge this idea of that, well, the nation state is a collective identity. But I don't really think that's that, because in responding with, is racial identitarianism something I have no choice over, what he's trying to highlight is that, okay, yes, there's the nation state, and in some sense that is a collective identity, but what is that collective identity? It is the people, and the people includes everybody, so it's not an exclusive identity. Whereas if you were going to use any other collective identity, it's going to inherently be exclusive. So if you use the identity of white, you're excluding everyone in the nation that is not white. However, if you use the identification of being a civilian or having citizenship, being a citizen of the nation, then you're including everyone who has a right in that nation. And that coming from the root of the word nation for those who are born there. And while most modern nations do have a process for naturalization, that is the idea. If you're born in a nation, you are from that nation, and you have the rights of that nation, which are individual rights. Now, so Richard Spencer says, well, I want to engage with these things how they are in reality, not how they are in your idealistic world, which we'll get back to on that next part of the relevance of ideals. But he says, in reality, there certainly are groups, and these groups certainly do have power over individuals, because Sargon's trying to say, well, if you have collective rights, then you're going to have collectives that have power over individuals. And and Spencer replies, well, you do have collective groups, and they do have powers. However, you have to think that through, because I would agree that there are collective groups and that they do have powers in some cases, but then there is no, at least in America, there is no legal basis for rights for any collective identity, for the reasons that I've already outlined. That once you give rights to an exclusive identity, then now you have some people in the nation that have some rights, and some people in the nation that don't have those rights, and you have an inequality. So the reality is that, yes, there are collectives, and there are rights of the collective, but the rights of any collective are nested in the rights of the individuals that comprise that collective. Now, that is a point that comes from Ayn Rand. The idea being, okay, I'm an individual, I have rights. If me and 10 of my friends go and we form a group, that group is going to have rights, but you're not going to be able to do certain things to that group. You can't censor our speech. We have a right to the Second Amendment as a group and as a collective, but nowhere does it say that this collective group that we have formed has that right. It just says that individuals have that right. And as individuals who have formed that group, if you were to stop that group's speaking, you're infringing on my individual right to the Second Amendment. Understand? So there is no collective rights. There are only individual rights, which then grant rights to collectives. But once you start saying, well, no, we're going to have this collective ethno-state where white people have rights, well, then what happens to people in the nation that aren't white? They don't have those rights. Well, now you have a tyranny. Unless you're saying that there are no white people in the ethno-state, but that contradicts points that are later made in the live stream where they explicitly say, well, purity spirals won't be a thing because mixed people will be allowed in the ethno-state. Well, then that brings us back to this original point. Well, then you have a tyranny of them not having equal rights. So that's one point I don't agree with. And then also this idea, which is, I think is just silly, of corporations. Well, corporations have rights. Yeah, well, corporations are not collective identities. Corporations are corporations. For example, if you work for Verizon, you don't become a Verizon. You become an employee of Verizon. And in fact, in law, rights of the individual do trump corporate rights all the time. The clearest example I could think of is Hobby Lobby, individual rights. So there you go. I want to move on to this idea of idealism in the conversation and what relevance it has, because the argument I just made for how individuals have rights and that's the basis for collective rights comes from Ayn Rand. But Sargon was arguing from a philosophical basis of John Locke, which I also think is sufficient and could easily be argued against collective identity from his point of view. However, Richard Spencer responds that, well, I want to talk about these things pragmatically, and I don't appreciate you bringing in these philosophical ideals, which you can just paint this ideal on the wall and say this is how it should be, but in reality, that's not how it is. Things don't work in the perfect way of John Locke's writings, so he just writes off all arguments from fundamental ideals, philosophical ideals. He says, not pragmatic, I don't want to do it. Then maybe 10 minutes later, not even 10 minutes later, he's talking about the ethno-state, and he says, and I quote, the ethno-state isn't ideal, and it should be thought of as the teleological end goal, although he does mispronounce teleological, which I thought was pretty funny. But it's the teleological end goal. And so that kind of then contradicts his argument that he made 5 minutes prior, where John Locke's arguments are an ideal. And it's not pragmatic. He wants to deal pragmatically. But then so it begs the question, all right, so then what is your pragmatic argument? Well, it's this ideal. In other words, he says, you have an ideal, I want to talk about my pragmatic ideas. All right, well, what are those ideas? Well, they're also an ideal. Well, then it's the same shit. So either you have to accept the arguments being made from John Locke, or you have to throw out your arguments of, well, my ethno-state is an ideal, and you have to start talking specifically about what you mean. And so he gets really hammered down by that when Styx asks him for the actual logistics of like what would that ethno-state look like, and he knows that it would look like tyranny, which is why he can't get into it. Now he does say it could potentially be peaceful. He says there's a historical precedent. You can look at the Versailles Conference, 1919, the Paris Conference of 1919. I don't think that's really a great thing to point to, because the Versailles conferences were a post-war conference that were happening in a very unstable environment, which is not really comparable to the one we have now. And they widely outlined the tyranny that would go on to cause World War II in terms of the reparations placed on Germany and the heightened collective identities that were reinforced by the redrawing of borders. So you're saying, yes, this happened before and the redrawing of the borders was peaceful, but then it could easily be argued in a very, very fair way that conference went on to lead to one of the craziest and most deadly wars ever in human history. So I think that's a silly argument. I would even play that out in another context. You can think of Crimea, which is a similar argument when the Russians took Crimea. Well, it's Russian speaking, it's ethnically Russian, it's a Russian history. It's really just redrawing the borders to better reflect the ethnic distribution. Well, what did it end up doing is it ended up making things worse than they already were, fueling a civil war in Ukraine that's still going on and just destabilizing the world and the environment around it. So these are not good examples, and I think they're actually his best examples still prove how this is a bad idea. And so this goes into the next thing of what is white. And I think a lot of people are really hammering down on like, oh, it's really annoying that Sargon would have kept asking, well, define whiteness. But I actually think this is very important because he's trying to make the point that it's contextual. And I think that's really, really important. So Millennial Woe, who I have to say really just added absolutely nothing, just really added nothing at all to like this debate other than just making it more confusing and hostile than it needed to be. So honestly, I hope that he's not reinvited back on, but whatever, it's not my call. He keeps asking this question of, well, is so-and-so white? Is Morgan Freeman black? And then eventually Sargon replies with, well, have you stopped beating your wife yet? And I think a lot of people heard that and were just like, what the fuck is Sargon talking about? He's ducking the question. He knows that it's an obvious yes question and that he's proving himself wrong. Well, here's what he's talking about. And if you were to walk into an elevator and there's two guys and you walk in, you're the third person, and you're going in between floors, and one of them says to the other, hey man, have you stopped beating your wife yet? Well, that's a loaded question because now it's giving you information. Now you know that this guy at least used to beat his wife. And so if he says yes or if he says no, either way, he's admitting to the fact that he used to beat his wife. And Millennial Woe is in the same way asking a loaded question. Is Morgan Freeman black? Yes, Morgan Freeman's black. Oh, so there are ways in which you can just tell that someone's black. There is something called black and white. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That's what he's trying to get to. That's what everyone's trying to say. Sargon, you know exactly what the fuck we're talking about. You look at someone, you know what race they are. But there's really no nuance to that argument, and I have to say their inability to understand what Sargon is saying either has to be like willfully ignorant or just like surprisingly ignorant. But I'll try to explain what I mean by that. So is Morgan Freeman black? Not necessarily so, and that really depends on the context, because again, it's contextual. So in America, Morgan Freeman is obviously black, but if you were to just transport Morgan Freeman into a tribe in like Africa where they don't speak any English and they have had very little contact with the outside world and they don't know who Morgan Freeman is, and they see this guy and he's speaking English and they just know that he's some sort of American, well, to them, they're probably going to see him as a very much so an outsider and probably not black in the same way that they see themselves as black, assuming that by black we mean African, of African descent. Obviously so. Obviously there's always levels to this, and we see this in history. As was pointed out in the debate, well, Italians and Irish people at some points were not considered white. Like the idea of Polish people at some points were not considered white. The idea of what is white is not necessarily black and white, and I mean, think that that's a pretty provable historical fact, but they just don't want to engage with that. John Frank makes this argument, looking at somebody gives you more than random information to their race, and while this isn't perfect, shouldn't this be enough? Which I think is just a silly argument, and you can, again, it's contextual, so let's play that out in a context that really highlights why that's silly. You can think about it as pregnancy. Well, if you look at someone, you kind of know if they're pregnant or not. Yeah, most of the time, but sometimes someone just put on weight, or sometimes someone goes 9 months pregnant and has no idea. Like that TV show, I didn't know I was pregnant. These things exist, so it's really not black and white, which is why if you think you're pregnant, you have to get a pregnancy test. If you come up positive, you have to go see a doctor, get an ultrasound, take all sorts of tests. That's why it's very, very specific, and being pregnant is easier to prove than being white. So obviously it's a very tricky, very, very tricky aspect of this. And so they finally get into a little bit more specifics, and John Frank, I think, does a good job with really clearing the water with this. But so they get down to the fact, well, there's an ethnic component to race, and then there's a cultural component to race. However, the cultural component is descriptive. So you may say people are ethnically white, but then they have a latent behavior or general behavior in which we can describe, and that is whiteness. But that's descriptive. That's not prescriptive. But it begs the question, or Sargon at least asks the question, so what do you do with the dissonance? What happens if someone is ethnically white, but culturally doesn't fit the descriptions you have given? And he says, and I would have to agree, well, then it does become prescriptive. And Richard Spencer proves that to be true maybe 15 minutes after this, when he says, well, yeah, white Muslims would not be allowed in the ethno-state. Only Christian religious faiths would be allowed in, because that doesn't fit the description. And so it does become a prescription. So if you are ethnically white and you choose to become Muslim, well, now you're not allowed in. And you can try to justify that. You can try to add all different levels to it, but the reality is religion is obviously a cultural aspect. And that's just one example. And Sargon also, it leads into the final point, so I'll just get into it, of the purity spiral and the ethnic cleansing. And Richard Spencer tries to shoot this down and says, well, is this a problem in Poland right now? Which obviously the answer is no. But what you're really saying is there any precedent of this happening? To which the answer is obviously yes. There's historical precedent all over the place. In fact, the origin of our species, Homo sapiens, came from the killing, the cleansing of our cousins, Homo neanderthals. Like, it's latent in our DNA. In fact, there are studies that show of why there's an evolutionary argument to be made of why there's the ability to genocide others, why racism has an evolutionary basis, and why sexism does not, because those genes would be punishing themselves if they carried a mechanism for sexism, if that makes sense. But you can Google, you can look into that. It's really interesting. But I just want to highlight, like, in 5 minutes, Richard Spencer says 3 quotes that I just think really just show why his arguments are just so full of shit. He says, sure, I can imagine there being a purity spiral. A few moments later, it could be a problem, sure. A few minutes later, but I don't believe in purity spirals. I just don't even know how to engage with that. Sure, I can imagine there being a purity spiral, and it could be a problem, sure. But he doesn't want to engage with the reality of what that would look like. He just wants to downplay it. And then when he gets pressed on that, he just backs away from it completely. Oh, but I don't believe in purity spirals. And he has a habit of doing this all the time. He says he's a demagogue. Like, for example, he gets pressed on, well, he says that people that like football, that's not really white, because he knows that his fans in the alt-right don't really like football that much. But anime, anime is totally fine. In fact, we should have more anime or less anime, depending on what the situation calls for it. And I do think that really highlights just how much of a demagogue he is, and how he has no frame of reference for his arguments. He's just trying to fucking be an asshole. It's very clear to a lot of people. But Sargon points out correctly, you're already having this problem in the alt-right. And Richard Spencer's reply to that is, well, just because people are saying things on Twitter doesn't mean that that's reflective of how they would be in reality. To which I think that's mind-blowingly ignorant for someone to say on a debate that's taking place on a live stream online. If actions and words on the internet aren't reflective of reality, then what the fuck is the point of watching this debate? That's that. And then, so Jean Frank says, there won't be a purity spiral, there will be mixed race people allowed in the ethno-state, which then brings us back to this idea, okay, well then you're going to have a collective right given to white people, which is going to cause a tyranny. So that's not acceptable. Or you're going to take those people out, which that's not acceptable. And in doing so, that'll cause a purity spiral, and that's not acceptable. And John Frank says a lot of fucking stupid shit. And one example of this, he says, can't our current country be corrupted in 200 years when it becomes majority Muslim? And the answer is no, which Sargon just shoots down because that would require, one, the environment to change from what it is right now, which is not what anyone's arguing for. Two, for a collective right to be given to the Muslim majority, which is not what we're arguing for. And so you're saying in 200 years, when everything's different and things are the opposite of what you are arguing for in this hypothetical situation, can't things happen the same way you're laying them out? I do think that is a silly argument. I thought that the debate was widely silly, but I did think it was very helpful to allow Richard Spencer and Millennial Woe and Jean Frank to lay out their ideas and their justification for collectivism. And I thought it was very interesting the way in which the alt-right's ideas overlap with the radical left's ideas. But I don't know, hopefully you guys understand where I'm coming from. If not, that's all right, but thanks a lot. So recently, blah 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 blah, wah 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 wah.